bother him, okay? Don't send him any text messages. Don't call him. If you need anything, call the office. I know I'm not Pastor John, but I think I could just fill in for the next week or so. He will be back next week, so just don't bother him while he's on vacation. Number 2 is Vacation Bible School is coming up in just a few weeks. So out on the table, we have some cards. If you know some kids that could benefit from being here at Vacation Bible School, make sure you grab one of those cards. There's a little QR code on it. They can actually scan it and sign up online, or they can come that night and sign up. If kids can only come a couple nights, bring them here a couple nights. It'll be a great time, and that is going to be the first week in June, immediately after the school is out for the summer. So those things are out there. But today we are continuing our series in the book of Ruth entitled Finding God in the Ordinary. Very easy to find. If you start at the beginning of your Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. So start at the beginning, you'll eventually find it there. Very quickly, as you're turning there, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 2 this morning. And as you're turning there, I heard a story about a cowboy who was buying health insurance. And he met with his insurance agent, and the insurance agent, of course, began to ask him a list of questions, what it's like to buy health insurance. So he was asking him all these questions, and the list went on, age and height and weight and all those things. And finally, the insurance agent asked the cowboy, he said, in the last 12 months, have you experienced any accidents? And the cowboy said, no, I've not had any accidents at all in the last 12 months. So the insurance agent went on and said, well, have you, in the last 12 months, have you been to see the doctor or been in the hospital? And the cowboy said, yeah, last fall, a rattlesnake bit me on the leg. And so I had to go see the doctor for that. And then just this spring, my horse kicked me in the chest, laid me up for a few months after that. And so the insurance agent had this very confused look on his face. And he said to the cowboy, he said, well, wouldn't you consider those two things to be accidents? And the cowboy said, no, they both did it on purpose. Thanks for the pity laugh. Okay, anyways. And the truth is, what I want to talk to you today is the truth behind that, is that if you're here and you are a believer, you are a follower of Jesus Christ, that there are no accidents in our lives. There are things that may take us by surprise, which may be good or bad, but in God's economy, there are no accidents. That God has plans and he has purposes that he is going to bring about, even though from our perspective, they may look like coincidences, they may look like accidents, they may look like happenstances. Because Isaiah chapter 46, verse 11 tells us this, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it. It's important for you and I to understand that everything that God has planned to do, he has either done or he will do. God is not a God who has plans and has this ideal future in mind and then hopes that someone will come along someday and fulfill his plans and his purposes. No, he says what he plans to do, he will ultimately do it, because with God, there are no accidents. And so I just want you to hold on to that for a second as I just kind of bring you up to speed where we are in this series entitled Ruth, Finding God in the Ordinary. Because as you read the book of Ruth, there are no explosions, there's no car chases, there's no parting of the Red Sea, dead people aren't raised from the dead. As you read through the book of Ruth, you find out that God is just kind of working in the ordinary, through ordinary circumstances and ordinary people, in order to accomplish his extraordinary plan. And so if you were here with us the first week, we looked at the first few verses of Ruth chapter 1, and we saw how Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons, they moved from Bethlehem and they moved to Moab because a famine had come. And there, in that first week, I encouraged you that sometimes it is better to stay when it could be easier to go. God wanted them to stay in Bethlehem, but they packed up and they moved off to Moab, where it could have been easier for them to live. The second week, we looked at the second part of Ruth chapter 1. And there we saw that Naomi decided, hey, her husband had died, her sons had died. It was time to move back to Bethlehem. And they packed up everything they had and Naomi went with her two daughters-in-law, and she tried to encourage them. She said, hey, go back to Moab. And Orpah, she bounced. She went back. But Ruth, she stayed with Naomi, and they ended up going back to Bethlehem. And in week 2, I told you that in order for us to get to the wrong place, we have to be willing to leave the wrong place. But sometimes we've got to leave the wrong friends behind. We've got to leave the wrong desires behind. We've got to leave the wrong job behind in order to get to the right place. And so in order to get to the right place, we have to leave the wrong place. And so today, the take-home truth that I want to give you is just simply this: as we look in Ruth chapter 2, and what we're going to see here is that there are no accidents in God's providence. There are no accidents. If you go forward here a few slides, I think I forgot the memory verse, but keep going. Okay, keep going. There it is. All right, we'll go back one. All right, there you go. All right, there are no accidents in God's providence. That God does not have any accidents in his providence. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11 tells us this. Now go to the next one. There it is. He who works all things after the counsel of his will. He works all of these things together according to his will and his plans. And so as we talk about this, there's no accidents with God's providence. You may be asking the question, what is providence? I'm glad you asked that, because I have the definition right here on the screen. Providence is the mysterious way in which God interconnects people, places, and events to bring about his desired will. He uses different people, he uses different events, he uses different places in order to bring it all together to accomplish what he has intended, what he has desired to do. Because what he plans, he will do it. And that's exactly what we're going to see here in Ruth chapter 2, that there are no accidents in God's providence. And so we're going to pick it up in Acts chapter 2, but I just want to give you just a little bit of background. We left off last week. Ruth and Naomi and Ruth, they had left Moab. They came back to Bethlehem. And Naomi told everyone, even though her name meant pleasant, she said, don't call me pleasant anymore. She said, call me Mara, because I'm bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me. However, at the end of Ruth chapter 1, there's a little foreshadowing that happens here that clues us in that maybe there might be a glimmer of hope. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, it says this: and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The spring had come. Now the house of bread, Bethlehem, the house of bread, now had bread again. And there's this glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things might turn out okay for Naomi and Ruth. And so in chapter 2, verse 1, it begins this way. Now, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband. Now, we read that word kinsman and not really sure what that means, but it's a very specific term that was used in the Old Testament. And it was what they called a kinsman redeemer. That if you had a close relative, that if you were in trouble, or if you were bankrupt, or if you had lost your husband like Naomi had done, that a close relative could be your redeemer, that he could step in and he could take care of your property, he could take care of you, he would be that redeemer. And here, again, we see this foreshadowing that there might be some hope. Naomi had lost her husband, she had lost her sons. Ruth had come back with her. Ruth had lost her husband as well. And now we understand that Naomi may just have a kinsman. And so it goes on. Now, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth. Now, we read that and we say, well, he must have been really rich. However, the original Hebrew language, that term is very ambiguous, because it's a term that could mean a man of great stature, a man of achievement, a man of wealth, a man of character, a man of valor. And typically in the Hebrew, that word is defined by the context in which it's written. However, here in Ruth chapter 2, the context, as I said, is ambiguous. And so it's the idea, and I think it's ambiguous for a reason, for us to understand that Boaz was all of those things. As you read through the book of Ruth, he was a man of wealth. He was a man of stature. He was a man of character. He was a man of valor, because he was all of those things. And it goes on and it tells us who this man is. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, I told you as we've gone through here that if they were to make the book of Ruth into a movie, it would not be an action movie. It'd be a chick flick that would air on the Hallmark Channel, okay? And so it's at this moment the camera would pan to Boaz as he's kind of walking through the streets of Bethlehem, and everybody's kind of attracted to him, and he's got the perfect smile, and his hair's perfectly combed and all of that, and he's just a man of standing in the town. And then it would probably go to commercial break, and you'd be left hanging. Okay, how are these two ultimately going to meet? And what we're going to discover is that there is no accidents in God's providence. And so the first thing that we see here as we look at our text this morning is Ruth's proposition. That Ruth makes a proposal because her and Naomi had come back to Bethlehem. They had no spouses, they had no jobs, they had no food at this moment. And so they are in dire need. And even though they had no family and no food, their greatest need here was that they had no food. And so they had to do something in order to achieve some sustenance so that they could ultimately survive. And so what we see here as we begin is that Ruth offers this proposal, this proposition to Naomi, and this is what it said in verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, please let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. Now, God had made a provision in his law. You can read about it in Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy chapter 24, where there was a provision that wealthy people who owned grain fields or fields with crops, is that they were to leave some standing for the widow, for the orphan, for the less fortunate, so they could come through and they could glean so that they too would have enough food to survive. And it was a way in which the rich could show their generosity, and it was a way in which the poor, the less fortunate, could still retain their dignity. They wouldn't necessarily need an absolute handout, but they could still work in order to achieve what they needed. And so that's what Ruth is saying. She's saying, I know this happens here. Let me go out in the field and let me glean. The problem is that if you were a young single woman at this point, it would have been very dangerous for you. There would have been wild animals. There would have been abusive people, all of those things. And so this is why she asked her mother-in-law. And so in verse 2, it tells us that Naomi said to her, go, my daughter. And so she gives her permission to go and to glean in the field. And then in verse 3, look at what happened. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now we read this and it tells us that she happened to come upon this field. In the Hebrew, it actually literally says she happened to happen upon that field. And it's almost as if the writer of Hebrews is kind of winking his eye and saying, okay, now this seems like coincidence to Ruth and Naomi that she just happened to come upon that field. But the writer of Ruth is kind of winking behind the scenes and saying, you know, all of you who are reading this, you know better. She didn't just happen to come upon the field, but that God had sovereignly directed her to that place. Because here's the point. Ruth had no idea who Boaz was. Ruth did not know which fields Boaz owned. She had just had this plan to go out and to glean in the field in order to take care of her and Naomi, which helps us to understand Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, which tells us this. There it is. Okay. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So Ruth had this plan to go and glean, but it was God who directed her steps to the right field at the right time in the right place. And I think all of us, if we were to pause and stop and look back over our life, I think we too would be able to understand the truthfulness of this verse. That I had plans, but it was God who directed my steps. Me personally, I had plans to go to college, and God directed me to go to a specific college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I ended up meeting my beautiful wife and having 2 beautiful children. Okay, you probably can look back over the same way, that I had plans to get married, and God directed me to this person whom I'm now married to and have a wonderful life with. I had plans to get a job, and God directed my steps so that I would have the job that I have today. And it's just been wonderful, or maybe not so wonderful, but you can see how God directed that. Because the truth of the matter is, listen, the truth of the matter is that there are no accidents in God's providence. That you have plans, but God ultimately directs your steps. So we see, secondly, here, not just Ruth's proposition, but secondly, we see Boaz's protection. Boaz, this man that we were just introduced to at the beginning of this chapter, it tells us in verse 4 about his protection because, as I said, Ruth would have been extremely vulnerable to the conditions, vulnerable to the people, vulnerable to wild animals that could have been there. And so what we see here now is God has providentially brought Boaz along in order to provide protection for Ruth. And so in verse 4, it starts this way. Now behold, Boaz came to Bethlehem. Now, if you've been around for any length of time, you know one of my favorite words in the entire Bible is the word therefore. Because every time we see the therefore, we're going to find out what the therefore is there for. My second favorite word in the Bible is the word behold. Because behold is a demonstrative particle. And it was written in Hebrew to really be kind of a road sign in literature. So if you were to read this in Hebrew, if you came upon this word behold, it would mean, hey, stop and pay attention to what is going to be written next. The behold is there to focus the reader's attention on the next words or phrase that come right after that. And so here, the writer of Ruth said, behold, listen, what comes next is really important. Boaz, and I want to add the words, Boaz just happened to come from Bethlehem. He was in Bethlehem. He just happened to come out that day to check out, to see what was happening in his fields, and look what just so happens to happen. In verse 4, he came from Bethlehem and said to his reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you, which shows the deep faith of Boaz. In verse 5, then Boaz said to a servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is that? She just happened to be in his field. He just happened to come from Bethlehem. He just happened to be looking around. He just happened to see this young woman named Ruth in the fields. And he is assuming that an attractive young woman like that must be married to someone. And so he said, hey, who is this woman and who does she belong to? In verse 6, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. Now, if you look back in Ruth chapter 1, when Naomi came back to Bethlehem, everybody said, oh, Naomi's returned. She had been gone for a number of years. Some of them didn't even recognize her. But the story of Naomi and Ruth returning to Bethlehem would have spread all over town. Boaz would have surely heard the story because, after all, he was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband, who had passed away. And so now he finally has a face with the name. He had heard about this girl, Ruth, but now he finally sees who she is, that she is the one who returned with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And then in verse number 8, Boaz speaks to Ruth and said this. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. You know what Boaz is doing there? Yeah, he's working the angle, right? Hey, you stay here. Don't worry. I'll take care of you. He's trying to make sure that she's around every time he's around, okay? And then in verse 9, he said, let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. And what you see here is the very first workplace anti-sexual harassment policy. Right? That's what he said. He said, hey, I told them they're not allowed to touch you, no sexual innuendos, nothing like that. They're not allowed to harass you. And what happened here is that she thanked him for everything that he had done. She then relays the story to Boaz, which he had probably already heard. And in verse 12, it's our memory verse. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. I think right here, Boaz understood the providence of God. He's saying, may the Lord reward your work. May the Lord be the one who blesses you. Even though I'm trying to protect you from a human perspective, ultimately it's God whose refuge that you are under. And then what happened next is that Boaz and Ruth, they had a little lunch date. Okay, and after lunch, look at what happened in verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Verse 16, and you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. And so he's actually just trying to provide even more for her. He's kind of stacking the deck so that she is able to have more than she needs. And here, the whole time, as Boaz is protecting her, what we can see is the sovereign hand of God in his providence over this entire situation. God used Boaz to do it, but it was God who brought Boaz along at the right time. And what we see here is that there are no accidents. Listen, there are no accidents in God's providence. And what we see here at the end of this chapter is God's provision. Ultimately, it's God who provided, because in verse number 17, it tells us that Ruth had quite a day. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah of barley would be about, 7/8 of a bushel, probably about 40-some pounds of grain is what she would have gleaned that day. That would have been way more than anyone would have ever imagined gleaning. And here is Ruth, who came into the field that day just hoping to scratch together enough to provide for her and her mother-in-law for maybe a day or two, and then she'd have to go glean again. But here in this one day, she gleaned enough that would provide for them for the next several weeks as a result of Boaz's kindness to her and God's provision for her. And so she ended up going back home. Verse 19, her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? Like, I haven't seen this much before. May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is," guess who? Boaz. Which is a name which would have caused Naomi's ears to perk up. And in verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and the dead." He's shown kindness to you and I. He's even shown kindness to my husband, your husband that has passed away. And then again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." In the Hebrew, that's a very specific term, which is sometimes in a English version of the Bible translated kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer was that relative who would have had to meet two qualifications. He would have first of all needed to have the power and the resources to redeem someone, but he also had to be willing to redeem that person. And what happened here is Boaz is a type of Christ. Boaz in his life ultimately points towards and points forward to the ultimate kinsman redeemer. Jesus, who came into the world as God in the flesh, as the perfect sacrifice. He had the ability to redeem, and he didn't just have the ability, but he had the desire to redeem. Hebrews tells us, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. He is our kinsman redeemer. And so here, Naomi gives this information to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and says, this is the one who may one day be our kinsman redeemer, the one who one day may take care of us and meet all of our needs. And then chapter 2 wraps up with these words in verse 23. So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Barley harvest would have been April to May. Wheat harvest would have been June to July. And so for about 4 months, a number of weeks, you know what Ruth did? Every day she would just go out and she would glean and glean and glean in order to provide for her and her mother-in-law. And the totality of this entire chapter, what I see repeatedly, is that there are no accidents in God's providence. There are no accidents. Things don't just happen. But in the providence of God, he brings them all together for his divine plans and purposes. So, because all of that is true. Well, I was going to add one more. Because all that's true in chapter number 2, what should we do? And so I want to encourage you today is what we see happening here in Ruth chapter 2. It's what Ruth did. I want to encourage you today in the same way. Do what you can do and trust God to do what he can do. That's what Ruth did. She did what she could do. She did what she could. And she went out and she gleaned, and at that point she just trusted God to do what only he could do. And he did more than she could ever even imagine. And so when you're in those times and when you're wondering, is this an accident? Is this a coincidence? Is this a happenstance? You just do what you can do and trust God to do what only he can do, because repeatedly we see that throughout here in the life of Ruth. Because listen, there are the things that happen do not happen by chance. Listen, what you see here in Ruth chapter 2 is Ruth and Naomi and Boaz operating in their own free will. They're making decisions, they're reacting according to just who they are, their personalities, and the decisions that they make. But on the other side of that, on the other side of that coin, what you see is God's hand providentially working in each and every one of them. And there's some tension there, like free will and God's providence, but yes, they both work together. And so that's why you and I do what we can do and trust God to do what he can do. Because listen, let me just go back and tell you what happened here. Naomi just happened to say, let's leave Moab and go back to Bethlehem. They just happened to show up in Bethlehem during the barley harvest. Ruth one day just happened to say, let me go glean in a field somewhere. Ruth just happened to come upon a field that was owned by Boaz, who, by the way, just happened to be a close relative of her father-in-law. Boaz just happened to show up from Bethlehem that day. He just happened to see Ruth down there gleaning in the field. He just so happened to speak to her. He just so happened to provide for her, and God just so happened to bless her. It's almost as if God has this deck stacked. And none of that, listen, none of that would have happened apart from human free will. And none of it could have happened without the divine providence of God's hand. And so you and I do what we can do, and then we trust God to do what he can do. And again, I want to encourage you. As you sit here today, look back over your life. No matter how long or short it's been, look back over your life, and you will see, slowly but surely, the ways in which God's providence has led you to where you are today. And this truth is so true in every aspect of our life. Do what you can do and trust God to do what he can do. In your finances, do what you can do. Show up for work. Save your money. Get out of debt. And then just trust God to do what he can do. In your relationships, do what you can do. Okay? Be the first to apologize. Be the first to offer forgiveness. Be the one who's loving, and then just trust God to do what he can do. In your spiritual life, do what you can do. You show up for church. You attend small group. You get involved in other people's lives. You serve. You give. And then on the other side of that, you just trust God to do what he can do. It's true in every area of your life. Do what you can do. Trust God to do what he can do. And the truth of the matter is, let's bring this even home, even here today. The truth of the matter is that you just so happen to be here today. We planned this sermon October of last year. You just happened to be here this day that I just so happened to be preaching a sermon that we planned back in October. You just so happen to be going through the circumstances of your life at this moment. This just so happened might be the day in which you take that step to grow spiritually. Today might be the day that you just so happen to take that step to make a commitment to follow after Christ. But whatever the case is, it's by no accident that you're here today. Because there are no accidents in God's providence. So do what you can do and trust God to do what he can do. And in the end, you will be glad that you did. There are so many things in my life that as I look back over, at the moment, at the time, I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe something had gone wrong. But now when I look back over my life, they weren't accidents. They weren't coincidences. They were the divine providence of God in those situations. Someone has said that life is much like reading Hebrew. You have to look at it backwards because Hebrew's written right to left. You have to read it backwards. In the moment, you may not see it, but after you get through it and as you look back, you're going to see the divine providence of God because there are no accidents in God's providence. So do what you can do. Trust God to do what he can do. And until next week, go serve your King. Father, we thank you for your word today. We thank you for the ways in which it speaks. Thank you just for the ways in which you work in the ordinariness of life. That here in Ruth and Naomi and Boaz's life, you did not do anything miraculous, but you worked in the ordinariness of life. And so I pray that as we leave here today, that we would be able to see your hand in the ordinary ways of life. That you would lead and guide and direct our steps as we do what we can do. And we ask all this in the name of Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.